Hello, many thanks for joining us for this online talk this evening. We're presenting and formally launching a new research project called To the Northwest, Intra Yugoslav Albanian Migration, 1953 to 1989, which is supported by the Austrian Science Fund, the FWF, at the Centre for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. So in normal circumstances, this would be done live at the University of Graz, but given the pandemic conditions, we've opted for a Zoom project launch, and we hope to see you at events next year in person when the situation allows. So we're at the start of a 4-year project, and we very much welcome any suggestions that you might have, particularly regarding accessing useful sources. Any tips or feedback is very welcome, so please do feel free to send it to me. We're a 2-person team. My name is Rory Archer. I'm the PI for the project, and I'm joined by Mladen Zobec, who's a PhD researcher, and he's undertaking his doctoral studies on the research topic at the University of Graz. In Graz, we're supported with the project implementation and administration by our colleague Tanja Bilever, and we're collaborating with 2 more researchers, Radoš Panic, who's a PhD student in Graz, and he's working on the social and cultural history of Yugoslav Albanians. And another collaborator is Rina Getzi, who's a Pristina-based anthropologist who's been working on a similar topic at MA level, and she's written actually one of the very few studies on Albanian migration to Croatia. So details about the project can be found here on our project website. This is recently launched. We'll keep some regular blog entries, some news and reports posted here quite regularly, so please do have a look at it. What the research project is basically aiming to do is to diachronically explore the phenomenon of Albanian migration from the Yugoslav southeast, so that's Kosovo, Macedonia, to the Yugoslav northwest. These are the socialist republics of Slovenia and Croatia, and the period we're looking at is from the post-World War II era until the 1989 revocation of Kosovo's autonomy. I should mention here, we're concerned with Yugoslav citizens who are of Albanian ethnicity rather than citizens of the neighboring People's Republic of Albania. And I suppose the main goal of the project is to explore the diverse ways that Albanians in Yugoslavia experienced and understood socialist modernity, and we do this through the prism of cross-cultural migration and labor migration, which is happening within state borders. So in addition to archival research, the project will rely on oral history and other historical anthropological methods. My focus on the research will be on Croatia, and in particular, I am looking at the regions of Istria and Kvarner. Here, the lower red dot on the slide marks Pula, which is the largest city in Istria, where I'll be based in doing the oral history segment of the research. And my colleague Mladen Zobec is going to conduct his research in Slovenia. So to provide a little bit of context, by the late 1980s, Albanians represented probably over 10% of all Yugoslavs. So they were certainly the largest non-Slavic nationality, but they're frequently quite absent in the historiography, in particular in social and everyday history, even though in population they were much larger in number than Montenegrins, and probably late in the 1980s, larger than Slovenes, Macedonians, and probably Muslims, Bosniaks as well. But predominantly rural in origin, Albanian labor migrants gravitated to industrial centres around the country in search of work, particularly in the 1950s onwards, when a liberalisation of residence registration coincided with industrial expansion across Yugoslavia and tourism along the Adriatic coast. So the presence of Albanians, who are mostly labour migrants from Kosovo and Macedonia, was very ubiquitous in the towns and cities of Yugoslavia during socialism, and probably those of you who are from Yugoslavia or from former Yugoslav states or have spent some time there are familiar with the stereotyped figure of an Albanian baker or an ice cream shop owner or jeweler. But in spite of this ubiquity, the intra-Yugoslav migration and the subsequent experiences of Albanians living and working in Croatia and Slovenia and other Yugoslav republics has not really been systematically researched. Since the 2000s, scholarship has weighed in on how ordinary Yugoslavs understood, experienced, shaped, and were themselves shaped by the project of socialist modernization. But within this kind of literature, scholarly accounts of Albanian experiences of Yugoslav socialism remain fairly limited. Isabel Strule correctly observes that the historiography prioritizes mutually exclusive Serb-Albanian and perhaps Macedonian Albanian historical claims and antagonisms. Comprehensive studies of Albanian migration within Titoist Yugoslavia are still fairly absent in the historiography, and indeed the social and everyday history of Albanians in Yugoslavia is a historiographical blind spot. So I think that some of the studies which look at socialist era Macedonia, where Albanians represented a very large minority, can illuminate the ethnicized division of labor and Albanian marginalization vis-a-vis that socialist republic, and maybe can offer some countrywide indicators of the types of dynamics taking place. So Robert Pickler observes that Albanians did not have equal opportunities to participate in the project of socialist modernization. Rosita Dimova demonstrates that the intersection of class and ethnicity bore different material results for Albanians and Macedonians during socialism, with Macedonians tending to enjoy class advantages as a comfortable state-sponsored lifestyle. After World War II, ethnic Macedonians tended to migrate to cities, taking up industrial or white-collar jobs, while Albanians tended to remain more attached to the land through subsistence farming, and later in small businesses. And so because of this pattern, Albanians relied less on the state and social sector for employment. And this is the trope that we see emerging in the migration experience to the northwest as well, with Croatian and Slovenian authorities frequently fretting about the lack of participation of Albanians in the party state and self-management institutions in the communities to which they migrated, as well as a predilection for work in the private sector supported by kin networks. So one of the claims which informs this research project is that widespread anti-Albanian attitudes were not only the preserve of Yugoslavia's Serb population or Yugoslavia's Macedonian population, and actually during socialism, Croats, Slovenes, and many other Yugoslavs sometimes viewed Albanians with suspicion, subjecting them to practices of othering that resemble Western European cultural racism. Albanians have been represented in the Croatian and Slovenian public spheres in racialized terms and pathologized in ways not dissimilar to that of Roma minorities. Catherine Baker, in her study on race and the Yugoslav region, observed that the intersection of religion, ethnicity, and social class for Albanians in late 1980s Yugoslavia saw them, I quote, simultaneously labeled as fundamentalist Muslims in Serb nationalist media and treated as a semi-racialized, culturally and ethnically distinct underclass in Slovenia and Croatia. So sources of distrust and even outright hostility towards Albanians in Yugoslavia stemmed from several interrelated factors. These would include a purported Albanian loyalty to the external homeland of Enver Hoxha's Albania, which of course is often presented as an enemy state of Yugoslavia. We could also add the linguistic and cultural isolation of Albanians in relation to other Yugoslav peoples. Also Christian animosity towards a largely Islamic group in the context of post-Ottoman nationalist discourses and the Kosovo myth. And here I'm thinking specifically of the official Yugoslav historiography. This wasn't something which is only the preserve of Serbian nationalists. Also a distrust of rural homesteads and patriarchal kinship patterns according to socialist morality. And perhaps most importantly, particularly when we're looking at the 1980s, is that with the official federative Yugoslav interpretation that the 1981 demonstrations in Kosovo were counter-revolutionary and an illegitimate expression of nationalist excess, anti-Albanian sentiment across the country grew, and the security services followed the activities of potential irredentists very closely. So Croatia, and in particular the northwestern areas of the Republic, so the regions of Istria and Kvarner I'm thinking of, it was a particularly important location for Albanian migrants who were drawn to the area due to fairly favorable economic conditions. This is one of the richest parts of the country with the developed tourism industry and kind of a more broader industry as well. And it also had connections with Albanian transnational networks in Western Europe. This is again an area which is not far from the Italian and Austrian borders. So a 1988 report from the Security Services Pula branch detailed the security situation in the area of Pula relating to the Albanian complex. So here we can see the term complex already in the title is suggestive that all Albanians were seen as potential security risks. So the report describes how in the 1981 Yugoslav census, only 768 individuals declared themselves as Albanian in Istria, but that number was certainly much larger due to undeclared workers, those who were not registered with the authorities, particularly those who were employed casually in the private sector and on a seasonal basis. So according to the authorities in Pula and Poreč and elsewhere in Istria, the 1981 demonstrations in Kosovo led to an increase in the number of Albanians in the area. There were estimates that at least 2,500 Albanians were living in the area, and this number would increase by quite a bit during the tourist season. Unlike most Yugoslavs who tended to work in the social sector, Albanians in Istria and Kvarner tended to be employed in the nascent private sector. Many found employment in a growing number of private businesses and hospitality and crafts, and some of these reports mention goldsmiths, filigrani, ice cream parlors, and they also refer to sellers of fruit and vegetables, and informal work in construction and day laborers. So it's also clear that the authorities made direct links between the suspect category of private business owner and alleged networks of Albanian nationalists and more general criminality. For example, here we can see security services in Pula reported, and here I'm just going to kind of give a very rough translation. The original text is here in Croatian, but it says something along the lines of, the most interesting group are those owners of private businesses, ice cream parlors, jewelers, due to their exceptionally high material status. It is indisputable that such a status is part of the consequence of one's own work in combination with favorable conditions of a touristed region, and this enables the gaining of an enviable financial result. However, information received also suggests that a meaningful number of Albanian owners of private businesses gain huge earnings on the basis of malversations, illegal currency exchange, bypassing regulations, and especially through smuggling. The problem of smuggling various goods is widespread, including smuggling weapons. For these businesses, further opportunities are offered by the fact that it is a border region. There's a large frequency of foreigners and the possibilities enabled by small cross-border traffic. So although Kvarner and Istria are synonymous with a very robust interpretation of Brotherhood and Unity and an openness to outsiders, this normative multiculturalism ran parallel to an ambivalence and indeed a widespread resentment towards incomers from the Yugoslav South. For example, in 1987, municipal authorities in Rijeka observed that the economic migration of Yugoslavia's Albanian population was constantly growing, with Albanians being the most numerous migrants to the region. The authorities claimed that the Albanians' ways of working and living there were closed in comparison to northwest Croatia, and allegedly problems of interpersonal relations with the local population required more careful monitoring than had been conducted so far. The municipal authorities were essentially suggesting that Albanians were culturally separate and tending not to participate in the local institutions of self-management and the party state. In Pula, Albanians are accused of deviant property speculation and excessive in-group solidarity, which allegedly grew contempt from local Istrians. So the security services reported claims of dissatisfaction, revolt, and antagonism among the autochthonous population of Istria, with the conclusion being reached among some that we are financing our own counter-revolution. So despite cultural racism and animosity towards Albanians in the Yugoslav Northwest, there were degrees of solidarity and alignment of political interests which existed between Yugoslav Albanians and sections of Croatian and Slovene society, particularly in the late 1980s, giving a growing fear of Serbian hegemony. So far I've been focusing on some of the difficulties of migration and participation in public life for Albanians in Croatia, but there are of course many factors which facilitated mobility and helped many to thrive in the Yugoslav Northwest as well. And first and foremost, there was a common Yugoslav state framework, the ideology of brotherhood and unity, and some degree of cultural familiarity as well. And all these could help undergird Albanian migrants in Croatia, and if nothing else, they were citizens of the same state. So despite some of the negative accounts of Albanian migrants which were circulating amongst municipal and city authorities and the security services, there was also more positive perspectives in discussion as well. For example, the Sunday edition of Dalmatia's major newspaper, Nedelja Dalmacija, provided a series of detailed and generally fairly sympathetic accounts of Albanians in Dalmatia in the late 1980s, albeit from the perspective of an outsider's gaze upon an exoticized group that needed to be somehow discovered and explained to the readership of the newspaper. So rather than interpreting a lack of interest in participation, self-management, and party state as something being a priori negative and as evidence of potential subversion, the series of articles in the Dalmatian newspaper gave voice to some Albanians, like one Pauli Pagliusi, who was a second-generation filigran, who stated, "We are interested in who will have more money. We are interested in economics and not politics." So these reports are stressing a combination of entrepreneurial and patriarchal values almost as a badge of honor and as evidence of self-help. So the journalist Dražen Gudic wrote, "Albanians, both Catholics and Muslims equally, are not inclined to seek help from society, particularly not in financial affairs, and they've developed a system of credit and loans in which interest doesn't exist, but the obligation, of course, rules to spend the funds wisely and in a suitable way to return the sum of money." So these interviews also provide a rare insight into the views of young Albanian men in the Adriatic coast. In many cases, the respondents are very positive. They affirm their experience in the area. Others mention the repressive political and economic conditions in their homelands of Macedonia and Kosovo. These are obviously motivating factors to move to Croatia. But for others, Croatia was just a stepping stone to the capitalist countries of Western Europe. So one anonymous worker at the Green Market in Split described that he had no interest in keeping to traditions and returning to Kosovo to get married and to build a house, but neither did he wish to remain in Croatia. So his plan was to depart for a Western European country whenever possible, and he was in Split to save money and to attempt to arrange paperwork. So he says, "We all say we are getting on well here, and that is true. But listen, here I am still a foreigner. I just work and sleep. In some foreign country, it cannot be any different, but I would be able to earn a lot more." So by the late 1980s, elements of the party state in Croatia, such as the trade unions and Slovenia, were openly beginning to support Kosovo Albanians striking against the revocation of the province's autonomy. The Cankujev Dom rally in Ljubljana, where the Slovene communists joined the opposition in support of the striking Kosovo miners in 1989, is cited as a milestone in the emancipation of Albanian migrants to Slovenia and arguably beyond it as well. So at this point, I'm going to stop and I'll hand over to my colleague, Mladen Zobec. He's going to speak in more detail about some of the Slovene-specific aspects of the project and also about his own PhD project, which tackles this. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Rory. Just a few words about the last slide regarding the rally of Slovenian support for the striking Kosovo Albanians. So this was in February 1989. 3 months before the rally, Slovenian Republican leadership contributed their votes for the lesser autonomy of Kosovo from Serbia. So it is crucial to have this in mind when retrospectively assessing the Slovenian political support for the Albanians in Kosovo. It was, yes, an important gesture, I know, but the Slovenia-Kosovo alliance is not as straightforward as it may seem. But we'll come to this question later. First of all, good afternoon to everybody. I'm Mladen Zobec, the second researcher on the project. Rory is going to cover Croatia, while I will be covering the Slovenian part of the project. And besides working on the project, I'm also a doctoral student at the Law and Politics doctoral program. And like Rory, I'll be working at the Center for Southeast European Studies in Graz. So since my research work is actually my dissertation work, let me first present the title of the PhD dissertation. This is still a working title. I'm still at the very beginning of the process, and the title, as you can see, is From Workers to Entrepreneurs, Transformation of Albanian Migrants in the Socialist Republic of Slovenia, from state-employed laborers to workers and owners of small family businesses. My plan is thus to research Albanian migration to Slovenia through the lens of small family businesses that were, perhaps still are, very characteristic for Albanians in Slovenia, Croatia, and probably elsewhere as well. Of course, a lot of my project work is going to overlap with that of Rory's, so I will not repeat those parts of the presentation, especially the methodological considerations, research methods, and similar. So Albanian migration to Slovenia. I would say that the characteristics of modern Albanian migration to Slovenia are similar to those of Croatia. It started somewhere in the 1950s and accelerated in the 1960s and especially 70s and 80s. What can be said for sure is that there are some major places in Slovenia where the concentration of Albanian migrants is and historically has been higher. So we have places like Ljubljana, Velenje, Jesenice that were prominent already in the 70s among Albanians. Later on, Kranj joined, and a coastal town, Isola. Isola is on the coast, and probably its touristic nature makes it a bit more similar to Rory's account of Istria than compared to other Slovenian cities. As demonstrated before, the literature on Albanian intra Yugoslav migration is scarce, and the same goes for Albanian migration to Slovenia as such. Although most of the labor migration was monitored by the Republican or federal authorities, it was nevertheless not thoroughly researched outside of the field of geography and demographics. Literature about Albanian small family businesses in Slovenia is even more scarce, but still it is worth mentioning two texts. First, we have a text from Jaka Vadnjal from 2014, The Importance of Social Capital Within an Ethnic Community, Albanian Entrepreneurs in Slovenia. So this article deals actually with social capital among Albanian entrepreneurs in contemporary Slovenia. So the focus here is different. It's contemporary Slovenia, not the Yugoslav history. And although the article is very informative, the scope of the research is nevertheless very narrow, and perhaps the article offers or puts too much emphasis on the national character as such without looking at what does this actually mean, or looking at the broader societal circumstances that might have been important for the functioning of Albanian small businesses and Albanian entrepreneurs. Next, we have a very interesting chapter from Ana Kladnik. Its title is Dobri Dol, Sweet Village, Albanians, Kiosk Culture and Urbanization in Socialist Slovenia. So this is a very interesting chapter that has been published in the book Brotherhood and Unity at the kitchen table this year, 2020. And Ana Kladnik explores the kiosk culture of Albanians, of Albanian migrants in Slovenia. And very importantly, she shows in the article, in the chapter, how Albanian small family businesses facilitated the process of urbanization in Slovenia, namely catering facilities provided by Albanians who were filling the lack of social sector. All right, so let me now speak a bit on the topic of the dissertation itself and on the question as to why focus on Albanian entrepreneurs. Of course, I'm not speaking of some mega wealthy capitalist entrepreneurs, much closer to the capitalists in Yugoslavia, where the managerial class, not the owners of small family businesses. But what is nevertheless striking is that there was a quite higher share of Albanians among small business owners, especially when compared to other migrants in Slovenia. But at the time of the first considerable numbers of Albanians migrating to Slovenia, they of course migrated as regular, unskilled or low-skilled workers, not as family businesses, mostly as workers in construction or other sectors of economy that employed large numbers of unskilled or low-skilled workers. And it is later on that many of the migrants, Albanian migrants, left their industrial jobs, and it is later on that many of the new migrant workers that came to Slovenia in later decades of Yugoslavia directly entered the small Albanian shops, bakeries, sweet shops, fast food joints, and so on. So without entering the social sector job market first. So to put it differently, the proposed research will try to reconstruct the changes that were undergone by Albanian migrants in Slovenia from the early decades from the early decades of their migration to the northernmost Yugoslav republics. And at first, the migrants were unskilled, seasonal, mostly male workers without pre-existing social ties to Slovenia, and there was no visible qualitative difference compared to Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian migrants from Macedonia or Montenegro. So what followed then in the later period, in the later decades of Yugoslavia, was a type of migration that was increasingly being characterized by the private or informal economy and family or familiar ties. Sorry. So this type of migration is obviously characteristic for Albanians. It does not mean, however, that the first type of migration simply vanished. It probably even didn't shrink in absolute numbers. But another type of migration that I just explained appeared and was evolving sort of further apart in character from the rest of the Yugoslav migrants in Slovenia. So if this hypothesis, if this assessment is correct, then there are two further questions that need to be answered. First is, what was the scope of family businesses or business facilitated migration compared to classic economic migration and employment in the social sector firms? And then there is the question of when did these changes or differences in Albanian migration became more prominent? I hypothesize that probably somewhere in the 1970s. Next, the issue of family businesses in relation to Albanian migration is twofold. On the one side, the workers themselves were becoming business owners or were transforming themselves from blue-collar workers to business owners. And on the other side, Albanian businesses started functioning as a sort of a platform that facilitated the migration of newcomers, mostly relatives or of close or extended family, but also friends, acquaintances, perhaps fellow townsmen or villagers, in any case, Albanian. So the ethnic character was predominant. So it is the central task or central focus of my dissertation to answer the main question, how and why this transformation in migration was actually happening. Okay, so the question, why become an entrepreneur in a worker state, is one that is very relevant. One of the important sub-questions, why did Albanians actually decide to become entrepreneurs in a state that was nominally de facto as well a worker state, a state that emphasized its workers' character? And of course, sure, the decision to migrate is always very personal. There is not one reason, and reasons vary across the spectrum and can be economic, political, and then there are many diverse psychological factors, individual psychological factors that influence the decision to migrate. And of course, among the Albanian migrants were not only manual workers or low-skilled workers. There were also some intellectuals, artists, engineers, and so on. So people from different walks of life. But the interests of the project here are ordinary people, for the lack of a better term. Perhaps it suffices to say just laborers. So they are in the focus of this study. Here you may of course ask yourself, how does the category of business owner actually fit into the labor migration? Well, those business owners were still proletarian in their character. I suppose most of their work comprised of regular labor, and management was only a small fraction of what they did. And as mentioned before, businesses were facilitators of new migration and also employers of new migrants. So that said, the question of how and why Albanians were more and more becoming involved in small businesses can be actually interpreted by focusing on two mutually intertwining sets of sociological, political, economic factors, the internal and external ones. So by external, I mean the Yugoslav or Yugoslavia ones, and internal factors would be ones that are owned to the Albanians themselves. So first of all, among the external factors is state policy or state policies. So despite being the largest non-Slavic peoples group, Albanians were never a constituent nation in socialist Yugoslavia. Moreover, notions of otherness were amplified by frequent repressive practices by the authorities, and a tradition of strong mutual distrust between the state authorities and many Albanians was actually spanning back to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and the socialist state was late and very partial in tackling this repressive dynamic. So simply put, having a business of your own means not being reliant on the state that you do not trust. Just to illustrate how practices of othering may have gone a bit further in Slovenia, the article in Slobodna Dalmacija from 1988 that Rory has referred to in his presentation mentions that Croatia, or Dalmatia, Split concretely, is a better destination for migration because although the money in Slovenia is better, the Slovenians, look at you like you have a disease. So this is a statement from an Albanian migrant from Split, and I think it's quite illustrative. Next, we have the unequal economic development as another potential factor contributing to the decision for establishing a small business. So in Kosovo and in Macedonia, Western Macedonia, Albanian populated part of Macedonia, there was a growing surplus of agricultural labor force, most of Yugoslavia, and also a growing, increasing rate of unemployment. So economic underdevelopment of Kosovo and parts of Macedonia was one of the motors behind the emergence of an entrepreneurial culture in Kosovo and Macedonia, whereby weak social sector in Kosovo or segmented labor market in Macedonia, they could not absorb the high unemployment rates and thus enabled the expansion of the private and informal sector, which started actually to function as a sort of a social corrective mitigating the high unemployment. So perhaps the entrepreneurial culture is something that the Albanian migrants to some extent already brought with themselves when migrating. And lastly, there are internal or Albanian factors, and most importantly, family or household structures, and of course, the corresponding modes of subsistence that existed in the 20th century, namely, well into the second half of the 20th century, Albanian households and families were often distinctively large and highly important actually in organizing social and economic life. So this is not it is not a surprise. So that it's not a surprise that the migration to the northwest was often facilitated by members of close or extended family. And here, importantly, small businesses provided a platform for the inclusion of newcomers into the new environment. So I think that at this point, both Rory and I would be thankful on some comments from specialists on the topic. I know that in Graz we have quite a few researchers that have dealt with this question of family household structures in Kosovo, Macedonia in the past. Especially the question is important since it appears that some leftovers of customary law may have been important for the way that the businesses functioned, having their own system of microcrediting or system of favors that enabled the businesses to to multiply, new businesses to be established, and so on. Okay, so these are actually the places where I will try to look for the answers as to why Albanian migration in Yugoslavia was so often characterized by small family businesses, and much of the questions that were voiced in this presentation will be answered in the next phase of the research, namely the archival research and oral history interviews with the Albanian migrants in Slovenia themselves. So as soon as the epidemiological conditions get a bit better. And of course, I would be glad to talk more on the preliminary results or main open questions of the research, but I will stop here, and we can, depending on your interest, continue in the discussion. So thank you for now, for your attention, and I'm hereby opening the floor for any comments, reflections, questions, or both. Thank you.